What's up and welcome to the Level Health Podcast. Today we are super excited to have Dr. Eric Helms back on the show. You probably already know Eric, so you know this is going to be a monster episode. We are doing our best to predict the future of the fitness industry and chart a path for professionals looking to best serve their clients. Big thanks to Eric for coming on our show. We highly recommend you check out the podcast Iron Culture that he hosts with Omar Esoff, his books The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, and his coaching service 3D Muscle Journey. And if you're a fitness professional that wants to unlock the best results and most relevant research for you and your clients, be sure to subscribe to the monthly research review Mass. We'll have all of that linked in the description. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode.
Dr. Eric Helms, thanks for coming back on the show, man. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure and a privilege. Good to see you again, Josh.
And what I know about you, you hate compliments, but I'm going to start right out the bat saying, I wanted to say you and Omar have been killing it on Iron Culture. I don't know what it is. Y'all have been covering some higher level topics lately, like tyranny of progress, my favorite irresponsible influencers, things like that. So I think that like I said, going a little bit on a higher level is kind of what inspired this episode we're going to do today.
I love it because for us, we're just going low level. We're just talking shit about people. We're just trying to break through that rock bottom that we don't think we're ever going to hit, because we can always get more depraved. No, but in all seriousness, I appreciate that. Yeah, we've been trying to provide our deeper thoughts on subjects, and hopefully that's been helpful to the listener. It sounds like it has. So awesome.
Oh, of course. And last time we talked about really like the X's and O's stuff, like dangers about changing body composition, physique, sports, those kind of inherent issues in that, and then also just how personal trainers can improve. But like I said, we're going to go a little bit more meta today. We're going to try to do a little bit of predicting the future, if that's all right with you. I know that nobody can actually do that. Nobody can predict the future, but the way that you're connected, the way that you've talked with people just across the industries, I think that this is going to be a good help for people.
Get out my crystal ball. We'll do our best.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what we want to accomplish with this, we want to help create like a potential framework for, people that want to get into being a personal trainer, and also fitness professionals that are looking towards the future, because gosh, it's changing. The industry is changing. The people in it are changing. And we want to kind of, set a little bit of a framework and chart our path a little bit better.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So I'm thinking we break it down into kind of three discrete categories that I sent over to you, starting with knowledge. So this is kind of, again, this is a huge landscape of things, but and when it comes to like being a fitness professional and looking towards the future, do we need to go to college? Do we need to do the formal institution route? What do you think? What are your opinions on that?
I don't think it can hurt at all. But I don't think one needs to necessarily have in the States, a 4-year degree, or in other parts of the world, a 3-year degree, specifically dedicated to like exercise science to be an effective trainer. I think ultimately what's important is that trainers learn the basic principles of the things that they're going to be engaging with and potentially impacting. So I think understanding things like progression, overload, fatigue management, exercise psychology, goal setting, motivation, good interpersonal communication, principles of nutrition, and then probably a bigger overarching theme is I do think the one thing you do not always get, but that you should get in a good undergraduate program is learning how to learn, the ability to critically appraise things. And this is, I don't actually think every university or college has the courses necessary to help one do that. But courses specifically on critical thinking and logic have been actually shown in research to be effective in reducing the number of like untenable beliefs that people have. Basically, if they believe in pseudoscience, or they believe in, well, less so with conspiracy theories because they're a lot harder to shift. But when someone does have pseudoscientific beliefs and they engage with a critical thinking course intended to teach people about that, rather than just being exposed to science generally, they're more likely to change those beliefs. And that's been shown empirically. So I think if you can cover all those bases without going to a university, fantastic. And I certainly think it's possible. And with the way the education space in the fitness industry is growing with all the different continuing education options and non-traditional routes of education, I don't know that a university is necessarily required, but I do think it can fulfill those buckets for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, you've really frustrated me because you reminded me of my least favorite professor in all of college. It was a psychology as a science course, and it was exclusively about, for one, obviously reading research and understanding the different parts of research, but also how to identify and then have the tools to then identify pseudoscience. So that was the first 6 weeks of that course, was just what are some of the principles that people espousing pseudoscientific beliefs are going to utilize. And you mentioned the education space is growing. What does that look like? Is it a lot of like new up and comers coming into the space? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, the ability to provide education online is something that we've all seen expand rapidly in the last 20 years, and it's only increased logarithmically with COVID, and where everyone was required to figure out a way to do things online. And that infrastructure didn't disappear now that we have moved out of the more intensive lockdown COVID phase. Like for example, I mean, like I said, so that gives so for one, that gives the opportunity to organizations like personal training certifying bodies um, to create more robust education platforms that might have more or less interaction than your typical kind of weekend course that probably you and I were used to coming up, is what people would typically do to get working in the gym. A great example, shout out to the Sports Nutrition Association. I'm on their board, as is a lot of other great people like Gabriel Fundaro, Eric Trexler, Joe Klinzeski, Lauren Conlon, etc. Like organizations like that are cropping up more and more and more, and there are pathways to ensuring that the content is high quality, reviewed. It can get you to a place where you have a certification, even potentially get liability insurance. Has continuing education connections with other universities. So with that, not being limited by geography anymore, you're now getting people to leverage creativity, and they can find ways like, okay, so regionally right now, I couldn't get accredited for this education course, but what if I look overseas, or what if I look to another state, or what if I look at Canada, or whatever? Like there's, that might sound like it is, oh, is this legit? But ultimately, it's legit if it is, and the fact that there are more ways to connect across various parts of the globe allows opportunities for these organizations to connect and create pathways to graduate degrees, or to create new niches in the field, protection for people. So I think as that continues to expand, and as the online learning space becomes more normalized, and you can do it at a higher quality, like the LMSs, the learning platforms that exist now are much better than they were, say, in 2010, when I actually did my first online learning courses. It was basically just like a forum back in the day, and now, like, the quality of recorded lectures, the interaction, it's all been quite built out. So like I said, the infrastructure is there, and it's recognized, and universities are doing it, and you can take university courses online at major universities now. And I think universities have realized that if they want to stay alive, they have to provide some of these less than traditional pathways, and become a little more flexible. So yeah, I think that is only going to continue. And there's a double-edged sword there. It's very easy to not know who is a legitimate and who is an illegitimate education provider. So I think some things that like, okay, this is actually gives me course credits, or this is actually recognized as a CEU by some of the bigger certifying bodies. I think you still have to have some of those litmus tests. Yeah. But the availability of such courses is just becoming more and more and more, superfluous. It's pretty much everywhere. Not superfluous, that's not the right word, but
I couldn't correct you on that. I could not correct you on that one. It sounded right. But so I wanted to go back. I actually had it written down to talk to you about Sports Nutrition Association for a little bit, not just because you're involved with them, but also because it seems like they're doing something pretty unique. Is it Alex that's ahead of it? That ability to then be covered to do some of these practices that, I guess a nutritionist, not stopping short of RD, of course, but nutritionists would be able to do. Can you describe is it my correct impression thinking that they're doing something really kind of novel in this space?
Yeah. So Alex Thomas is running it. Yeah. The Sports Nutrition Association essentially the angle he took and why he created it, he is from Australia, was there was more and more and more essentially lawsuits being taken against fitness professionals and people claiming to be nutritionists, and they were being found negligent and having legal ramifications from that. So they're getting sued basically for the equivalents in the U.S. And that is also happening in the U.S. as well. There's been some pretty high profile cases in the last couple of years of, influencers providing. Yeah, you probably know some of the
Oh,
instances.
I know. Let's just call it Brittany. But I was very happy to see that when that happened, because it definitely seemed like there was some interesting and inappropriate things happening on that front.
Oh, and if you've been in this space, you know it all the time. Like you can find YouTube channels that suggest you don't need to get like cancer treatment if you're vegan or things like that. So just imagine if those like general messages become inundated with coaching. Someone monetizes that. And the type of advice someone might be giving on a one-on-one basis. And I've seen this forever in the bodybuilding industry. A huge part of what some of the coaches on the enhanced side do is provide advice to people about how to take anabolic steroids. And I don't think there's inherently a problem with that. But when you think about it, these are not endocrinologists. It's tradition based, and it's pushing the boundaries of what is potentially safe because people are chasing performance, right? So I mean, this is not a new issue. So this just to kind of that's the landscape, and there have been legal precedents now where getting sued for doing something that is considered negligent and potentially outside of your scope of practice is a thing. And the Sports Nutrition Association, it's not a legal body or anything like that. It's not providing a new scope. It's not a protected term like a registered dietitian that is backed by the U.S. government or the various governments around the world. But what it does do is it has provided a very robust education platform and the right tools that they ensure all of the members use when they're onboarding clients as far as assessments, so that they have underwriting from an insurance company where they can actually provide comprehensive sports nutrition guidance. If you look at what you can quote unquote actually do under most personal training insurance, it's actually quite limited, and you're typically not able to do anything more. And this is varies region to region, but in most cases you can't do anything more than kind of repeat the national guidance for nutrition. So that'd be like MyPlate in the US or the equivalent in other countries. There was kind of this discussed belief not too long ago that, hey, I can provide macros to people, I just can't give meal plans. And that may or may not be the case. It's, it really depends on the interpretation of a judge. So it's not like there's no clear legal precedence here, but if you get sued, you will be in a position where if you have to pay something out, then your insurance company is what's gonna back you. So, and if you go to your insurance company and you say, yeah, I was giving this person a meal plan, I didn't do anything wrong, but they sued me, and let's say it's actually true, and they go, well, that's great, but our insurance policy does not cover that. So what SNA does is that they have a third-party vetted educational curriculum, as well as all those assessments and bits and pieces of standardizing the way that the SNA practitioners work with their clients, so that they can provide information about supplements, macronutrient guidance, more specifics than your typical personal trainer would be allowed to. Ultimately, if someone sues you, they sue you, right? And you either be seen as being negligent or not. But if it falls on the financial burden falls on a trainer or a nutritionist's shoulders, then it's going to come down to, am I covered, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's essentially what the SNA is doing, and they've done a few other things, like actually just trying to get high level academics involved to make sure that everything is evidence based. But ultimately, it is just a high quality course that is long, provides pathways to postgraduate education and graduate level education, and also probably the most robust liability coverage you've seen, that actually allows sports nutritionists to do what they're doing and be covered while doing it.
Yeah, and it's no secret that if you want a meal plan. You just need to go to like your local supplement store, and the guy behind the desk is selling it. And it really is. I mean, it is kind of I want to say it's a friction. It's a bit of friction for fitness professionals, because it's not that most don't know how to apply nutrition principles. It's just whether or not that's even what the person actually needs at that time. And just kind of trying to plug the hole with a meal plan is kind of the go-to, but in reality, that's not really something that you over time you'll learn that it's really not what's important. Again, and you're able to kind of look back and be like, oh, I was just trying to plug some inadequacy or perceived inadequacy with being over prescriptive, when in reality it just wasn't how I was communicating. Everything wasn't there yet. And I think that's something that you just get over time, or kind of moving into what I think would be potentially, or I've kind of seen it happening already, but fitness professionals coming into the industry through more of an apprenticeship model, kind of, and more hands-on training. I'm what comes to mind kind of right away is the National Personal Training Institute, where they're doing a lot more hands-on work, and you're getting a dedicated fitness professional education. But are there any other apprenticeship, people doing something along those lines, where they're really mentoring fitness professionals coming in?
I think it depends on where you go to actually work, but there are many, 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 as you know, entry-level personal trainers. It's a career that most people who get into it don't stay, but those who do, have the opportunity to develop that experience. I remember when I got my first personal training job at the YMCA, I did get the opportunity to simply shadow one of the personal trainers there for a couple of weeks, and that was kind of their standard practice. And I really think that should be the way it is done. Whether that's going to get actually regulated from a top-down perspective, it varies region by region, whether it's industry regulated, whether there is actually some actual regulation involved, or a combination of the two. But I think it's a very important thing. And one of the things that I think you can't really do online is kind of get that experience, at least for in-person personal training. And that is also something people, I think, should realize, is that no matter how good your education is, it's not a replacement for experience. And some of those skills, you can understand the theory behind it, but actually implementing it is a very different thing. Like, you can take a course on motivational interviewing, or you can read a paper about the COM-B model, of like, how do you establish, like, motivation and provide people opportunities and competence, and then, okay, they'll take care of that. But what does that actually look like when you sit down with Jane? I think those things only will come from having some mentorship and some guidance, and proverbially, to get your hands dirty. So I think that should be something. I think ideally, I don't know that there's necessarily a push to do more of that, because it's not necessarily as incentivized. There are a whole lot of like business coaches and coach the coach and train the trainer type of courses that are out there. But most of them are online based. And whenever I see one of those, I am somewhat skeptical that they can actually provide the kind of mentorship that someone needs to be good. Like, if I was someone who owned my own gym and I was like the personal trainer manager, I would have mentorship sessions with people and pair them up with the head person every time they started, for like a multi-month period, to be honest. I don't know how common practice that is. I think in a lot of big box gyms, that's a non-existent or an extremely truncated process. So that is one that is a little bit worrisome. I don't know that there's a lot of, like I said, things change when they're incentivized, and I don't know that that's something that's necessarily incentivized.
Yeah, we're realizing that what we're trying to do with Level is really changing that the incentive structure in the fitness industry and amongst fitness professionals. But I wanted to ask why you said your initial, is it just the sniff test? You're seeing some of these coaching the coaches, trainers. Is it just like right off the bat? Is it some copy that they're using that you can tell is just kind of trying to hit specific demographic? What is that?
Well, I know it can work for online coaching, but I just don't. I like.
Gotcha.
If they're not there with you when you're in the gym with your clients, how are they going to help you in an in-person situation? That's basically how I see it. I mean, that, like telehealth, remote coaching, online coaching, whatever you want to call it, that is becoming a more normalized process. But ultimately, I don't think the need for people to teach you how to move and be there with you is going to go away anytime soon. In fact, it may be enhanced because we're spending more and more time at home in front of a computer. And ultimately, no matter what you write in a program or an Excel sheet, or you record as a video, or you show someone how to do something, they are going to go to a gym, or they're going to go to a park, or they're going to go to the living room, and they're going to exercise. So that that component is always going to be important. And if someone, it is very different teaching someone how to move in person than it is talking online. Giving them a video, giving them a PDF. And if you're in a position where you're doing that, I can't think of many ways that you can get mentorship without someone being there physically with you. So that's the sniff test is like, are you an online service providing mentorship to personal trainers? That's limited and like at word go. If it's specifically for personal trainers at the point where they're doing online coaching, remote coaching, then sure, because that is a specific skill as well. But I think, yeah, for your average personal trainer who's getting a job at 24-hour fitness, I don't know that there's a lot of structure in place to give them that hands-on guidance.
Yeah, and then the question is, what is the content? What is the curriculum in these courses? Is it to sell more training or to sell higher ticket training, or is it how do you utilize the tools and resources that we have available in 2022 to do your best job as an online coach or trainer? And that kind of brings me to the content produce. So there's so many, like you mentioned, there's so many content producers, so many educational content creators out there. It can seem a little bit overwhelming. So though it is an amazing time in 2022, how can you kind of direct your attention to the most beneficial sources of content? What are some red flags and then maybe some indicators that are also good?
Yeah, I think this really comes down to that critical thinking piece.
Yeah.
I made I should say, Jacob Skepis of JPS Health and Fitness made a infographic based upon an article I wrote in 2018, where we basically had, here's the sniff test, if you will, to use the term you used, of what does a pseudoscientist or non-expert, how do they speak versus how does an expert speak? And some of the things were like exaggerating, providing, framing something as black and white, not using references, really leveraging confidence, and doing things that are essentially done to build the trust or the belief in their confidence and competence level, and to seem like an authority, rather than to give you an appraisal of the information and a nuanced perspective. Now, interestingly enough, on that post that Jacob made, there was someone who posted, it was like, well, actually, that's not the sign of an expert. That's just someone being intellectually honest. And it is true that you can be incorrect and speak humbly about information, provide ranges instead of black and white, provide a reference, but it's wrong, or you misrepresent the data or whatever. But I think probably the more important thing is to delineate who is that the pseudoscientist non-expert, because I do think it's not possible to be an expert and to display those characteristics that we describe in that infographic as being a pseudoscientist, because that's just like, no matter what topic you learn, whether it's cooking, nutrition science, or exercise science, you have to understand a nuanced understanding of it so that you can actually be applied in a useful way. And you can't just be a demagogue or a talking head. So I think that key piece is pretty important. I just pulled up the post real quick. So like for the expert, they're again, this is not really an expert, but someone who is just doing their best to realistically engage and communicate information, which I think is really important. Is that they provide realistic outcomes or realistic timeframes, specific solutions to specific problems in specific contexts. They speak probabilistically, so some of the time, most of the time, almost always. They have a familiarity with the research for what they're an expert in, and state when they're speaking anecdotally. So that's an important thing, is that sometimes you will see genuine experts get a little bit of expert creep. They get positioned by, maybe they don't position themselves sometimes, but they get positioned as the guru, and then they take up that mantle because it feels good. I think, honestly, like Huberman is a great example of that. His, like neuroscience stuff is probably great, but anytime he starts slipping into other realms, he often gets looped into some things that aren't true. So, considering opposing viewpoints and shifting positions when good points are made, explaining when something applies and when it doesn't, focusing on principles, admitting they're wrong and changing their stance over time, and providing ranges, recommendations, guidelines, and they use appeals to logic and critical thinking rather than appeals to authority or what have you. And generally, just they display an attitude of being intellectually honest, humble, and they seem committed to learning rather than telling you the way. And they have a certain level of conviction that it changes. It's not always everything I tell you is the best thing ever. It aligns to the level of evidence we have. So if they're going on a limb to make a supposition, you can tell that. And then essentially, you look at the opposite of all those qualities when you're trying to identify someone who you probably shouldn't listen to, who might be a red flag. And unfortunately, sometimes they can be the more convincing speaker because if you combine that with a certain level of charisma, something that is marketable, and if they look or even have the credentials of an expert, I mean, how many shitty nutrition books have we been sold by MDs? It's probably just as prevalent as people with amazing bodies on Instagram, telling us to use their program. So yeah, I think you want to look for, it's far easier to assess somebody by that criteria and go, are they doing those things that I just outlined, or are they doing the opposite? And if they're doing the opposite, probably need to run the other way. Then it is to go, like, is their explanation of nutritional biochemistry accurate? So I think to some degree in the evidence-based community, when we play whack-a-mole, when we address pseudoscience, when we deal with these topics, we get into these fights where they're not actually interested in accurately representing the science. They might have sounded sciencey, they might have cited some study, but they've purposely cherry-picked, or sometimes not purposely. They have a certain viewpoint, and they're not doing the scientific method. They don't have a hypothesis and then look for research to see if it confirms it. They start with a conclusion that they have conviction in for whatever reason, because it's their bias. And then they look for research to fit that. So they've already landed on something. So by going, oh, they cited a study, well, let me show them this meta-analysis. Now they have changed their mind. They're not playing in the same arena. And I think we do a disservice to ourselves where we essentially think that we're in the same epistemic discussion with someone, but really we're not. And many times the folks who are doing this, they will happily on one day post on their Twitter, hey, this study shows what I've been telling you guys for years. And the next day they'll say, oh, look at this crappy study. The scientific community is, poisoned by industry funding, and it's all part of big insert, pharma, carbs, dairy, whatever someone hates or is the problem. So literally on 2 different days, they're leveraging science and they're attacking science just so they can maintain their belief and sell the same snake oil they're selling you. So engaging with them as if they are actually just an incorrect scientific thinker is it's not going to get you anywhere. So and they'll just pick the pathway or the physiology that supports their belief and not yours. So don't deal with the physiology. I think for the consumer and the trainer who's looking to become educated, you really just want to assess, is this person have the right intellectual qualities? Can I identify them as someone who is trying to honestly appraise and communicate the evidence or not? Because even if they're trying to honestly communicate the evidence and they get it wrong sometimes, that's a tiny issue. That's fixable, right? That's just read the study, but if someone is doing all the opposite things, they're going to be a disservice to you and your clients.
Absolutely. And again, it does come back to having that basic principles. I'd like to say it's kind of having a bullshit detector, like just having a basic, like you said, are they making sense with just what we know about basic biochemistry? That is a great first step in that direction. And I wonder if Google on a whole has been a net positive or net negative for confirmation bias. I'm sure that it's just been a force multiplier for it.
I think it's been a multiplier on both ends. It's incredibly helpful as an academic, I tell you that much. We can all think of times where we have appreciated Google. Google Scholar is a better search engine than for finding studies than all of the other databases combined. So but at the same time, if I tear my bicep and I'm nervous and I Google it, it can also make me freak the hell out. Like, oh my God, my tendon's ruptured when I might have just gotten like a grade 1 strain. So it will give us what we want. And sometimes what we want is not coming from a great place, or sometimes we don't have the ability to gauge whether what we want is accurate. So I think it is certainly a challenge, and it is the great problem that the social media platforms and the search engines face, is what degree of platforming and deplatforming of certain voices, ideas, messages, things that are viral needs to happen, because I don't think it was intentional that the algorithms will boost up whatever's controversial. But that is what's happened. People engage with things that trigger them emotionally. So, and the things that trigger us emotionally are controversial. So it's pretty easy to be like, hey, I want to sell something. Let me just attack something that is given knowledge. Like, vegetables are actually going to kill you, right? Everyone's going to be like, what the, and then all of a sudden I get all these likes and looks. And if I happen to look great and I'm actually a good salesman, here we go. Now I can actually sell my book or what have you. And it really just came down to exploiting an algorithm. So I guess the question is all right, well, what does Twitter, what does Instagram, what does TikTok do with this knowledge? Like, okay, we can't just not boost up posts that get a lot of engagement, but is there some other element we can add to it to do this? And we've seen various levels of control exerted by the various social media platforms, like removing people or making certain things that their investigative teams behind the scenes have gone, okay, this is misinformation, we're going to not let this go viral. That's happened. I've seen that on Facebook. So it's an interesting thing that has been really a large topic of conversation in those tech circles with the way COVID went and with the way the 2020 elections went. And I think it's a really good thing that conversation's happening, but I really can't predict where it's going to go. But ultimately, I think the only thing you can do as a consumer of information is to get better at identifying who is using the language of truth and who is using the language of convincing and pseudoscience, because sometimes assessing the actual claims themselves are going to be beyond an individual's scope or expertise.
Yeah. So before we move on to skills, what really matters, what to focus on, like we kind of talked about the meal plans not really being the solution for most people. So I wanted to talk about that in a minute. But as someone who is well known as being intellectually honest and unbiased, do you have those principles just up on the wall somewhere you slap as you walk by every day? Do you have to remind yourself of these things? And is that something that just takes some self-reflection?
Well, I am biased. I think we all are,
right.
which is, I think that, and the reason I bring that up is not just to be like, don't compliment me, but it's to say that it's really important to realize that you are not immune. And that is something that I say to myself, because it is easy for someone who is an expert and who has a certain level of pride in their knowledge to go on a podcast and have the person treat them like they know everything, and then to step into that because you're on the spot. And then as you get rewarded by it, and if maybe your ego is a strong driver in some of your motivations, whether you realize it or not, all of a sudden you find yourself in a place that you don't even realize it, where you've bought into your own hype and bullshit, and you have opinions on everything, and you have a platform, and you're being irresponsible, and you're actually inducing some harm at times. You don't realize it, when actually all the hell you know about is bodybuilding, right? So I have seen that in some of my colleagues and some of the people in this space who've come before me. There used to be the joke that by the time someone turns 40 or 50, they're just going to go off onto Mount Crazy in the fitness industry, because there's been so many people who kind of started as more or less evidence-based, and next thing you know, they're off in la la land, like RIP Charles Poliquin. I think he's a great example. He's the first person who published about daily undulating periodization in the late 80s in what became the Journal of Strength Conditioning Research. And then 20 years later, he's talking about, avocados from certain regions in South America that are going to put on, 20 pounds of muscle on you in a weekend. So that is just one example of many that I can think of. And I think it's just really key for people to realize that we are all monkey brains, just kind of walking around with a phone in our pocket. So that being aware of just the human tendency to think quickly and when we need to be thinking slowly, I think is really important. But another large piece of it for me, I think there's two pieces. For one, I do probably have an innate tendency towards being skeptical. If I listen to the stories my parents tell me, how I wouldn't believe in Santa Claus, or how they lost me at a magic show and then they found me trying to look behind the curtain to try to figure out how it worked. Like no one taught me that at 4, you know. But I think I then ran with that to some degree. You know, obviously I pursued education, and when you start to actually get into research, when you have good mentors who are teaching you how to do research, they really help you learn the philosophy of what is the right way to think. You know, how do you know what you know, and how do you be as objective as possible? And you're taught to disconfirm your hypotheses. You're taught to, anytime you have an idea, figure out, oh, well, what would I see if that was right or if that was wrong in the world, and what are ways that I could test this? And if I can't test it, then I can't be too confident about it, and I have to use probabilistic language. You know, like the number of times during my academic writing where I'd be working on a chapter in my thesis, or writing a paper, and I would say something and it would be like, oh, this is this, and it'd be like, delete this, and it's like, this may be this, possibly could be, like, you know, like the amount of times that you learn to, instead of speak in black or white terms, like, is this, you know, like you watch the news clips and they'll have an expert who goes on for 5 minutes and they'll be like, so is it good or bad? Like, that's how often do we see that on in the news? That's the exact opposite of what happens in academia, or what should happen. You know, you start to think in too broad of terms, and then your advisor, you know, makes you go like, listen, it's not good or bad. Like, in what cases, when, why, to what confidence? Like, even when you do start to learn about research, I remember writing a review and I would be like, you know, this study showed X is superior to Y. And then, you know, my advisor goes, insert the p-value and the effect size. And I'm like, oh shit, okay, I have to read a little more deeply. So like, to what degree, to what size is the effect, you know, with what level of confidence, you know? So I think the way I am is a product of my education and also my personality, which drove me towards this education. And I think a thing that is really important is to remind myself that it's not about me. And I think that's where people sometimes fall from grace, if you will, and they become that which they hate. But like, for me, if I remind myself on a regular basis that, yeah, sure, it feels good to be acknowledged, it feels good to be seen as an expert, it feels good for people to be like, oh man, you really changed my perspective and I learned a lot from you. But to remind myself that I am in service to the community. I am not the messiah of the community. And when I get feedback, to remember that it's not just to appease my ego. It's okay if it does, I'm still human, but that it is hopefully feedback so I can improve, and information for me to know, okay, I am being of service. So that is one aspect of it. Another piece is I'm very fortunate that I work with a lot of other people. So when I represent, you know, myself or information, I'm representing AUT, I'm representing 3DMJ, I'm representing mass. And I think that keeps me in check, and more intellectually honest, a little more humble, and less prone to follow my ego. So that's how I got here.
Yeah.
And I don't know how useful that is to other people, but I think just to remember, it's not about you. If you're doing this to be recognized, acknowledged, and to feel like the smartest person in the room, you're probably going to be not the smartest person in the room, because you're going to let your ego get in the way of your own learning, and you might even do some harm. It's okay for that to be a little piece of it, but ultimately I think the primary motivator needs to be that you want to be in service.
Yeah, the scientific process just really drives home that reflection and that at least the attempt of objectivity. But I wanted to ask, before we move on to this next session, if we were to elect a messiah for the fitness industry, who would you recommend? Who would be your candidate? Is there any shining stars out there?
Would we elect as a messiah? That's an amazing question. I would be concerned with electing someone as a messiah. I think that tendency is probably the issue in humans, isn't it? You know.
Yeah, absolutely. As if people didn't have enough issues with fitness modalities and everything, diets becoming religions in and of themselves. Yeah, I guess we don't need to elect a messiah there. But so moving on to skills.
One thing I will say is vote Helms 2022.
Man, I was going to say, we'd endorse you. I mean, we obviously can't go with who's the strongest. We can't go with who's the biggest, because for all of the reasons we've discussed already. So I don't know, maybe a committee of some kind, perhaps. But
yeah, And more importantly, I'm not the strongest or the biggest. So we need to shift the goalposts so
Exactly.
that I can fit into the mold of whoever we elect. So
Exactly. To make yourself more comfortable. I was just
there
listening
it
to that
is.
podcast the other day. All right. So moving on to skills. There has definitely been a shift, because I would have told you maybe a decade ago, the most important skills for a personal trainer would be to solve problems for people, to find the perfect meal plan for somebody. But it really doesn't seem like that is the case. So looking forward, where have we kind of gone wrong in terms of skill, or not necessarily gone wrong? Where have we fallen short in terms of being an effective fitness professional?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's only slightly wrong to be like, we're here to solve our clients'
Mhm.
problems. I think if you shift the wording just a little bit, we're here to help our clients solve their problems, and then you're on point again. And I think this is something that most trainers learned the hard way, where they tried to get in there and do things for their clients and it just didn't work out. Or maybe it did work out, but it didn't stick as soon as they flew the
Yeah.
nest. Um, and yeah, I remember being a trainer and I used to be like, if you would just do what I told you to do, you'd be fine, you know? And it ultimately came down to just like a disconnect between understanding human motivation and and behavior change. So I think it is really important to learn this. Like, it's important to understand, like, what are the stages of change, and not just from kind of like I read them in my book by NASM or ACSM or NSCA, but also like, what does that look like, and what is your role as a coach at these different stages of change? Okay, you've got someone in the contemplation stage. You probably would interact with them differently than if they were in the preparation stage, right? The preparation stage, you might actually be like the prototypical coach, where they're like, okay, I'm ready to do this. So teach me what I need to do. I'm bought in. I'm not dealing with some of my own motivational barriers, and I'm a novice. I haven't yet acted. So tell me what to do. Awesome. That's when your typical personal trainer will crush it. But the reality is that a lot of our clients don't come to us, and the vast majority of people who would benefit from fitness and are seeking it out are not in the preparation stage. So what do we do with someone in that contemplation stage? How do we provide them the means to get the right education? And so that's just one example. But I think kind of what I first framed it up as is the difference between, solving your client's problems and helping them solve their problems. They're only a one word different in as far as that sentence, but they are an entirely different stance. And it's the difference between being a client-centered coach or being, whether you realize it or not, a authoritarian coach, or just maybe an overactive kind of nanny state. So like, I mentioned Calm B earlier. That's kind of a cool model that you can read in some of the coaching literature. And Calm B stands for competence, opportunity, motivation, and then the B is for behavior. So the idea is that those are the three areas that lead to someone being able to change behavior. So if you don't have the competence, if you don't know how to cook, right? If you don't actually understand anything about nutrition, it's very challenging to make meaningful changes to your nutrition. Likewise, if you don't have the opportunity, if you live in a food desert, if you're not well educated, if you have if you're not very mobile, so getting to the grocery store is a problem. Like, all the various things that could be a barrier to someone. If you the most common one, you don't have time, right? So if you don't have the knowledge, if you don't have the competence around nutrition to know how to make meals that work with your schedule that you can eat, or like another aspect of that is, I don't know how to make healthy foods that I like, you know. So yeah. So anyway, and then the motivation. You have to. That's the one piece that we sometimes get to touch on as personal trainers. We get taught the whole motivational interviewing stuff, and hey, connect this to something deeper. Sometimes it's just, hey, be a group X instructor and be a cheerleader with them the whole time, which isn't bad, but ultimately it should come down to, how do I take this person who comes to me with a rather murky goal that is not super well defined, and, in their words, help them define it more clearly, and help them discover and interrogate and verbalize why it matters to them. So those are just three examples of providing, competence, the motivation, and helping them make those neural pathways more connected to things, and firmly laid and attached to their values and their identity. and then the opportunity, making sure that they have the ability to leverage that motivation and that competence to something that's actually going to happen. So that's kind of a diagnostic criteria that you can go through. Is okay, where are we lacking in this trifecta to change this behavior? And sometimes it's the behavior itself that is the issue. We're sometimes putting our own beliefs or preferences on them in terms of what's the nutritional approach or the exercise approach. Like I could teach someone all the competence in the world on how to, track macros and train to failure and use resistance training with the high volume approach and progressive overload. And I make sure I help them find the most hardcore gym in their area. I help them find this, like the right supplements and all that stuff. And then I kind of help them find their motivation to exercise. But if I define exercise as bodybuilding, then they're going to find maybe that's great, but this behavior doesn't fit well for me. And that all those things actually should have been framed towards, doing endurance work and playing in an intramural soccer league. That might have been what was really important for them to make physical activity a lifestyle and to become healthier. So, or yoga or whatever. So I think those four elements all need to be in sync, and they connect to more things. Like understanding motivation is more complex than what I even described. If you understand like self-determination theory, which is really why it's important that it is client focused and client led.
Yeah.
Because I mean, how many of us have been told something that is true about us, and that if we did change, it would have made us a better person. But because someone came up to us and said, you know what, you're kind of a dick, or you know what, you really need to do X, Y, and Z, or you know what, you need to get your shit together. Like sometimes those kind of tough love, hard conversations have shifted the needle for us if it comes from the right person at the right time. And if we can clearly tell that their heart's in the right place. But a lot of times that just triggers the how dare you tell me how to live my life, kind of this threat to autonomy. Like even when everything else is correct about what they're saying, you don't want it to be true. You want to, cut off your nose to spite your face, right? So I think that's a really important thing to understand, is that if I tell you something about what you should do, it is far less impactful than if you come to that realization and you say it to yourself. So ultimately, the trainer's job is to deliver information in the most impactful and effective way possible. So rather than just tell people what you think they need to hear, giving that quote unquote tough love, you actually care about doing something that's effective and guiding them to the point where they realize, oh, I do need to do X, Y, and Z. This is important. And because then by the time they get there, they've connected everything else to it. Like for them to be able to say that, it needs to make sense cognitively for them, logically, and it needs to be connected to their emotion. But if you're saying it before those things are connected, it's very easily to rationalize, no, that's not true for me, even if it might have been if they'd come to it on their own. So I think that is a really, really important thing, is just understanding the difference between being a more of an authoritarian coach and being a client-centered coach.
Yeah, and I think finding where they're starting at. I mean, you could go through the whole process, but finding where they're starting at is really where the rubber meets the road, because their lifestyle, their schedule, their preferences, everything is going to go into that. And if you're just throwing a preconceived idea at them just right out the gate. In fact, actually, Eric Trexler in Mass this month, it was a pilot study he reviewed, but they found that humility plays one of the most important roles, and they proposed the POWA, the POWA, for the conceptual model of humility to really drive home this client-centered approach. So, the perspective, the other-centered focus, willingness to learn, and accurate self-assessment. So I was really, really excited. And that kind of goes back to, realizing that it's not about you. And from like a more grand perspective, what your effect on the industry, which we're actually going to go into on this next section, but also your day-to-day interactions with people, the effect you have on each individual, coming from that client-centered approach is, I think, just so absolutely important. So I'm glad that we covered that quite a bit today.
100%. It's a great article for any Mass subscriber. Make sure you read Eric's article this month. It's really good, and it goes into the Combi model and SDT as well. But yeah, the POWA model, I like it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds better. Okay, so moving on to perspectives to consider. This is probably the most nebulous out of all of these, but I wanted to talk about something you mentioned on your podcast recently on Iron Culture, and that's engaging and not necessarily debating with, but engaging with fitness influencers, people putting out BS, anything that we kind of see as less than productive for the industry. But the way that we respond and engage with that can be just as important and just as unproductive if we do it the wrong way. So how do we go about engaging with some of this misinformation and things like that?
Yeah, you know, if you talked to me about this, say, 10 years ago, I would have said, you know, I'm really tired of these whack-a-mole myth busting, you know, evidence-based folks who just spend all their time telling you what not to do and who's wrong, because it's low-hanging fruit. They don't actually give you any like, and here's what you do. And it's easy to criticize and sound smart. We actually have studies on that showing that if you criticize something but say the same topic as not criticizing it, you sound smarter to people. And it's just, you know, sometimes just bullying. Like if you looked at the way some of that content went. That isn't to say I was completely against the idea of myth busting, because there is a lot of harmful pseudoscience, but just kind of that was the way I felt about the industry at the time. And importantly, you could argue 2012 was the proto or even pre-social media age. In 2022, I actually think it is the duty of anyone who has the ability to disseminate correct information to actually combat pseudoscience, because it is so prevalent and it's incredibly harmful at this point. I mean, we have large movements telling you that vegetables are going to hurt you. We have a re-explosion of some of the like the low carb, you know, fads happening again, and not even from like, hey, this is a viable option, this is great, like what you'll hear in some academic circles, and this can work, and you know, it might be better for hunger, but you know, it doesn't work for everybody, and individual differences, yada yada, all that good stuff I agree with. But the, hey, your LDL doesn't matter anymore, and you know, like all this stuff, and let's throw science out except for the part that supports my position, and the solution to chronic disease, the obesity epidemic, and pretty much anything is not, you know, typical medical treatments or anything mainstream or that could be tainted by big carbs or whatever, but it's you got to go keto. And no matter what the problem is, eventually you got to go keto. So like that has become more prominent. Like you said, social media has been a force multiplier for it. And it is so prevalent that people engage with it at a very high rate. And they're probably just as, if not more likely to come across something that's potentially harmful, at least incorrect, than they are to come across the correct information if they are just frustrated with their health and jump on social media. Or even buy books, you know, like there's like most diet books. Like if you just go to the few bookstores that are around and just look at the diet books, it's a crapshoot. You know, there's a bunch that are just terrible. You'd have to go to a textbook section to find something that has actually, you know, good information. So I think considering that's where we are, and that I couldn't have predicted that 10 years ago, which should also make you question any predictions I make about the future in this episode. I think it is our duty to combat some of this. But the problem is that there are ways to combat it which are less and more effective. And we actually have data on this, and it comes from some of the political science. So there is the occurrence of what's called the backfire effect. The backfire effect is not the default. It's not the norm. But when people very strongly hold a belief, especially if it's a conspiratorial belief, which unfortunately are more common these days, challenging it can sometimes make them double down. This was actually shown in a study. Again, this was like 2013, 2014. So it was pre-COVID era, which is a really important thing for the listener to consider, where the CDC, the Department of Health in the US, sent out vaccine information pamphlets to parents in the US. And then they did an analysis on it. And the pamphlets were specifically debunking the idea that there was a connection between autism and vaccines, which was unfortunately still a prevalent belief. And it was the reason why there was vaccine hesitancy in parents for vaccinating their children. And again, pre-COVID, we're not talking about the way that has changed even more and become politicized. So this is an era where vaccines were not politicized in the largest population abroad. And they found that while generally sending out these pamphlets did improve people's understanding and accuracy in their beliefs about vaccines, and they reduced vaccine hesitancy at the group level, when they specifically looked at people who at baseline said they were the most vaccine hesitant, they actually increased their beliefs that vaccines were bad. And it makes you think, like, what's going on here? Well, if I am the most hesitant person about vaccines, that probably means that I think there could even be some organized effort to vaccinate us for malfeasance or some bad purposes. So if I'm now getting a packet, it actually manages to confirm my beliefs. Like, oh shit, look, the government is trying to force this down my throat. I knew they really wanted us to get vaccinated so that they could put chips in us or whatever. So it's one of those funny things where sometimes engaging with people with the staunchest beliefs can push them further towards it. And this can be amplified. And again, it's important to note that's not the norm, but it does happen. What is far more common is that providing someone with facts doesn't shift the needle. And the question is, well, why? And there are good and bad ways to engage with people. And there's also been studies specifically looking at simulated political discussions online, where they had basically two factors that they modified. They modified basically the rationality of an argument, right? So did the person use references? Was there logical consistency, regardless of whether you agreed with it, whether it's a left or right-wing opinion, but was it based upon evidence? Were the facts accurate and did their logic hold up, at least within their argument? So that was one modifiable factor. So they presented the participants with various levels of rationality in these arguments. And the other factor was civility. How much of a jerk were you? So while you were presenting this either illogical or logical argument that was referenced or not well referenced, were you being nice, or were you calling people names and blaming the ills of the country on the other side, etc.? And there was a very large effect, and I mean that in the actual effect size, so big, of civility on the perceived rationality. So even though these were independent manipulated factors in the study design, they had effects on one another to a pretty large degree. So the more incivil you were, the more of a jerk you were to the opposing side, the more they were likely to perceive your argument is irrational. And furthermore, there was an effect where that when people were asked about their overall perception of the political outgroup, so if you ask someone who is left-wing, after engaging with a very incivil argument coming from a right-wing source, how do you perceive the right as a whole? They perceive them as basically being less rational. So often is unfortunately sometimes the case where we find ourselves in these camps online in the fitness space. You might, we call it the evidence-based community. And we have some litmus tests where we decide, is this person part of my tribe or not, right? So, and we sometimes present ourselves that way. We're heavily focused on the evidence. Anyone who we don't deem as evidence-based, they can get the sword, or they at least get the rude comments, right? So if we're approaching people who are a little more focused on a certain paradigm of thought, or they leverage experience a little more, and we come across as an asshole, that actually harms the entire movement of trying to get people to use science more often. Oh, these are just these asshole lab coats who have no in the trenches experience, and they weaponize science to bully me. Yeah. And I've seen that. I see it all the time. And then I'll see that we actually have empirical evidence that actually harms our position. It's incredibly ironic, So what does that mean for how we engage with people? Well, I think we need to think about what's the difference between disinformation and misinformation. Because some of the things that get us rankled and gets us angry and gets us to attack people is when we believe that they're purposely putting out disinformation. So the difference is simply disinformation is the purposeful misinforming of people, giving false information on purpose. So this is false advertising claims. This is saying, hey, you should follow my program, you'll look just like me, and actually I've been on trend, and it's not the program, but you want their money. This is, selling turkesterone when the product doesn't even have any of it, and you're aware of it, right? And also not caring that there's no evidence to back up turkesterone as an effective supplement. That's an example of disinformation, right? Misinformation, however, would be that well-meaning person, maybe not always well-meaning, but someone who is trying to give you accurate information and they just get it wrong. And that's okay. And I think it's really important that when someone is actually presenting disinformation, that you probably don't go attack them or debate them, because they've already stated, hello, I am here to not be intellectually honest. And you're like, well, let me have a debate, which is all about two people being intellectually honest and getting to truth, or at least it should be. So in those cases, I think it's important to, on your own platforms, counter the message, but not the person. Yeah. Because when you go after the person, some of their followers are going to potentially get triggered. They might even come at you, and then it becomes an information war, and that's not very useful. But if you can just present a different perspective to a larger audience, or as large an audience as you have on this topic, at the same time as when it comes out, then you are actually providing some signal against that noise. And that's the way I suggest approaching disinformation. Approaching misinformation, however, I think it's incredibly critical that you act civil. You don't treat them like they're putting out disinformation and you are the self-righteous attacker of this person who dared spout something wrong on the internet. But rather you try to help them, because if they are incorrectly putting out misinformation, that probably means that they have a desire to put out good information. They just got it wrong. So some of the things you can do is to enter a discussion with them. And again, remember, it's not about the person, it's about the information. And the most important thing here is don't do it publicly. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, we're still the same kids in high school who did things we now regret because we were trying to be popular. And if you'd asked us, what does popularity mean? We couldn't even really describe it. But basically, I want to be liked and acknowledged. I want to feel comfortable in a group, and I want to be looked up to, right? So when you take someone with a lot of followers who's seen as a guru or a leader or an influencer or whatever, some position of some level of authority or knowledge, and you publicly, even nicely, say, hey, you're wrong, the knee-jerk response of any human being, whether they temper it or not, or whether you see it or not, is going to be, oh shit, how do I go into defense mode? However, if you simply send them a message and you say, and it's a one-on-one conversation, there's not, because basically the more people who are watching, I mean, if you think about it, if you get embarrassed, would you rather get embarrassed in front of one person or 10,000? Everyone is going to answer the same question, right?
I get embarrassed all the time. So, but I mean, oh no, you frozen.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, Jesus. You're just standing completely
still. I'm just still.
Oh, yeah. God. Okay. So, all right. So basically I think we can kind of, at the very least, don't be a dick. Whether you're approaching somebody who has been fed misinformation, disinformation, whatever it is, and they've started developing, or they've already developed this belief, being a dick about it is just not going to help. In fact, just as a quick example, I was talking with somebody the other day about their breakfast, and they were absolutely certain that almonds were a fantastic source of protein, and they were told that from their doctor. And so I knew right off the bat, I winced, but I knew if I come at this in any sort of aggressive manner, any sort of condemning manner, it's not going to leave the door open for change later on. So all right, so I have one more quick question for you, just to wrap things up for the episode. How do you assess, and do you assess, your effect on the industry, and what that means going forward?
Yes, I do, but I also care about self-care. So I am definitely prone to negativity bias. I'm the person who, I might get 100 comments on a video, and if there's one negative one, it can ruin my day. So I have to be careful. But I do look at comments, especially on things that have been around for a long time, where I'm actually getting to engage with people. So there's a big difference between me going on someone else's podcast who's huge and reading their comments for the first time when I'm exposed to someone, versus reading the comments on the 190th episode of Iron Culture. And neither one is a perfectly accurate representation of how I'm perceived. One is people who maybe run into me the first time. The other one is people who self-selected to look at me. So I'm aware that it's very difficult to just look at social media reactions and get an idea of, what does this mean? How does this come across, etc. So I actually find that the best way to do this is just to get feedback from my peers. This is another, benefit that I mentioned earlier of collaborating with people. I'm very fortunate that I have a double-digit number of people who do this with me, whether that's write articles for mass, publish books, provide information on podcasts and blogs and do coaching, etc. And I have, colleagues who are outside of that space as well at AUT, people who are educators, and they have a very minor presence on social media, where I kind of blend both. And, I can ask them, how do you feel like I'm representing this? Like, how do I come across online? And that is something I have done and have the opportunity to do, and I do semi-regularly, I would say. So yeah, I And I also have a really great wife, who gives me honest feedback on things as well. So I find that those metrics are probably the most important thing to me. Granted, those aren't necessarily the consumer of the information. I do read some comments as well, but I have to make sure that I don't get a lot of negative comments, to be clear. When I'm able to sit back and be objective about it. I get overwhelmingly positive comments, but I don't let those go to my head, and I do have a tendency to read the negative ones and just dwell on them. So my psychology isn't great for using that as a metric, which is why I leverage my colleagues.
Yeah, what a unique landscape it is we have to navigate now, especially somebody that's accrued followers and lots of comments, likes, everything like that, and reviews everything. I'm sure that you could drive yourself absolutely crazy going through that. But yeah, having those peers that you can trust is absolutely so crucial. But awesome, Eric. Well, it's always great to talk with you, man. I appreciate you coming on today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.
100% my pleasure. Thanks for having me.